And here I've provided a story structure example using Aristotle's three-act play, the most simple structure where we have a beginning, a middle, and an end. So we start out with the beginning, and as you recall, we need to set the stage. What's the scene? Set the scene. So the two primary questions we need to answer for the audience, or we need to provide for the audience so that they feel comfortable with our story is, where are we? So where are we in space? And then what is the period? What's the time? So in space and time, we need to define for them where this story is going to take place. So what we've done in our first visual frame here is we've provided the lower 48 states for the United States. So it's clear that we begin in North America, or the United States. And in the title, we frame this, we're discussing revenue by region in 2015. Okay, so we know where we are in time. We know where we are in space. So the two most essential questions have been answered with our data visualization. Okay, so now that we've set the scene, we need to define the challenge or create some tension in our story. So what we've done here in the middle, we can frame a business objective, create tension. So what we've done is we've titled this Revenue is Challenged in the West. Now, for you and I, this may or may not create tension, but if you're the vice president of sales responsible for this area, title like Revenue is Challenged in the West certainly will create tension because your primary job is to create revenue. And then what we've done is we've created a data visualization of a bar chart. We have all the different states and the revenue that has been produced in each of the states. And then we've defined specifically the Pacific region to help explain and contrast what some of the issues are with revenue in the West. And as we can see, we don't have revenue in California. We're having issues in Wyoming, Oregon, Arizona, Washington, Utah, Idaho, Nevada, Montana, etc. So we can tell, yeah, there's definitely a problem in the West. And note that we've sorted this for simplicity for our audience based on where the problem is the most significant. So the problem's the most significant at the top with decreasing significance as we move down the chart. Okay, so now we've created our tension. We're going to move to our ending where we're going to summarize the insight. So our ending is a method of achievement. It's designed to relieve tension. We can also present solutions to a particular problem. So what we see here in our visualization is titled Relocate Rainmakers from Other Cities. So what this data visualization has done is it's gone in and represented where the location of all our top salespeople across the country. And sure enough, we see that we've got a big problem in the West and Northwest. The closest we get to helping with that is San Diego and Denver. As well, we have a number of rainmakers, top salespeople in Cleveland, Little Rock, Houston, Tampa, Boston, a number of other cities. So our way that we're going to relieve the tension that revenue is challenged in the West is by proposing the solution that says we're going to relocate these rainmakers from other cities to help solve this problem in the West or Northwest. And so what we've just put together here with 3 different visualization frames is a simple story structure using Aristotle's 3-act play. Now, to provide a little bit more insight into the preference for audiences, particularly when it comes to moving from one frame to another, also known as frame sequencing. So which frame comes first? One of the editing decisions that we have to make when we're creating a narrative is which piece of evidence or which data visualization will we present first, which one second, and which one third. And so some of the research performed by Jessica Holman has focused exactly on this particular problem, this particular issue, this particular opportunity, and come up with a set of preferences based on empirical surveys. So for general audiences, they prefer a sequence or a change of time. So that's the most preferred. And as an example, we might start off with one data visualization view that is female SAT scores by test in 2009. So we represent that. And then our next data visualization frame is female SAT scores by test 2010. So everything's the same on these two. The only thing we've changed is time. And so this is the most preferred by a general audience because we're used to time moving, basically time changing. Calendars, different months on the calendar, different weeks, different days, different hours, etc. Okay. Now, the second most preferred sequence is a measure change. So if we look sort of down toward the bottom, we'll see what's defined here as a measure walk transition, where we might start off with one measure highlighted in yellow there, and then we might move to the green, and it's highlighting another measure. So, for example, we might be looking at sales, and then we move to profits. So this is going to be sort of in the middle. It's not as enjoyable or as preferred for an audience as changing the variable of time from one view to the next, but still reasonably acceptable from a general audience standpoint. And then the third most favorable is the general to specific transition. So if we look up at the top there, we have an overview of a map of different countries in the world based on a particular measure. And then we go from that overview to a more specific data visualization. We might think about it as a drill down visualization or details on demand. And that's the least favorable of the three to a general audience. Now, I also want to provide to you guys the third major approach to creating a narrative sequence or a narrative arc, and this is called the frame-based model. Okay, and it's created by a researcher named Neil Cohn, the University of California, San Diego, and it basically works on visual frames. In this case, the examples that are provided are using comic book frames. And so we proceed through a particular sequence of different states. And the different types of states in this particular model are the establisher, the initial, the peak, and the release. So in the establisher, so the first type of visual view, we define the characters. Again, the place in the world. So where are we spatially? It has a particular setting, and then it's in passive state. And so we might spend a minute, take a look at this particular visual image, and see what you think's going on there. So some of you guys may have said, well, it looks like a boyfriend and girlfriend. Probably the other most popular response is looks like a husband and wife. Could be a brother and sister for all we know. But most folks take a look at this and say, yeah, it looks like they have some sort of romantic type of relationship going on. The female is not so happy with the male. The male seems inattentive. Perhaps that's the reason for the unhappiness with the female. We don't know that, but that's kind of what it seems like. And you guys may have a number of different views or interpretations as well of what you're seeing. It appears that they're sitting in some sort of domestic setting. Looks like they're sitting on a couch. Often students say it looks like they're watching TV. So they could be watching TV. I suppose they could be bird watching out the window or another of other possibilities, but it appears they're in a domestic setting. So then we move to the initial. So the initial view type begins action in the story. It's the source of a path. So we may have a particular path that the story is about to go down. This is the beginning or the source of that path. There's a departure. We have anticipation of what's going to happen. So take a look at this visual view and then think about what is going on here. So one of the most common responses that I get in class is that looks like domestic violence, or I think she's going to hit him. So what we see, at least what most of us, our interpretation, is that the female has her hand raised about to hit the male. Now we don't know that. She could just be waving to us or something like that, but it does appear in this frame that she has begun source of path. She's engaged some action, and she's about to take a swipe at the male on the couch. So we start building some anticipation here. We're like, wow, I'm a little uncomfortable with what's going on there. So we're starting to have some anticipation, perhaps even some anxiety. Then we get to the third frame type called the peak. So the peak is the goal of a path. It's the culmination of an event, where an event has come together, the termination of a process, an interruption, point of maximum tension. And in our little story here, it certainly seems like it, because it looks like the instant right after the female has smacked the male on the back of the head. She has a pretty angry look on her face, and we've certainly come to the end of that path of action. And what's often noted here is that, yes, and the male has no change in expression. Then we move on to the fourth view type, known as the release. So in the release, there's a resolution to the tension. There's a particular outcome. There might be a reaction or a return, releases return to the passive state. Probably the most notable feedback from students here is that the reaction is basically no action. And that's basically what we see here. So if we compare our establisher with the release, we can see that the characters have resumed their passive state, and we're sort of, from an action or tension standpoint, we've reestablished a normal state. So this is the third and probably most nuanced and most capable story structure out of the three. And just like we did with the simplest story structure, I'm going to walk you guys through an example of a story with this more sophisticated and complex story structure. So we'll start off with an establisher. And so what we see going on here, we've titled this visualization frame, which you'll recall is an event in our story, as the Valero refinery locations in 2015. So notice that we've set the scene. The scene is in Texas and California. It's in the calendar year of 2015. We're using passive geography and imagery here. And then we're establishing characters, basically refinery locations, defined by the orange dots here. So very simply, we've established for the audience where we are, what time it is, and what's important to us. Then we move on to an initial. So an initial initiates a path of risk exploration. So we've titled this visualization Weather-Related Risks. And we've encoded a whole list of the most common weather-related risk events that will occur in the locations where our refineries are. So we have things like earthquakes, fire, flood, hurricanes, severe storms, tsunamis. And what we're doing here with the initial, because we've presented our refinery locations under the orange Valero, we've defined them as weather-related risks, and we see there's quite a few of them. We're creating in the audience mind that, there is some risk here. We may have future storm impacts where we had historic storm impacts. So we start creating some anticipation here. Then we move on to a peak. So specifically, we have risks in Texas. So hurricanes impact Valero refineries. We have severe storms that impact Valero refineries. So we can see those visualized here. We've got our orange refinery locations. We've got severe storms in blue and hurricanes in the light green. They're pretty well distributed near our refineries, so it's a significant concern. And now, a couple words about utilization of rhetoric. So at this point in our story, we might want to communicate that we're trying to scope and define a decision-making event. And we might want to introduce a particular character here. So we have a refinery manager, perhaps they're a VP of operations for Valero refineries, and their normal day-to-day job is basically to keep the refineries up and running, earning perhaps $500,000 every few minutes, certainly millions of dollars every hour, perhaps hundreds of millions of dollars every hour. So it's very important to keep these refineries up, and that's their primary job. Now, when we introduce risk, the refinery manager's job changes. So that refinery manager's job is instantly restructured into mayor of a small city. So most refineries, there might be 1,000, 5,000, up to 20,000 people that work in this one particular area, which is basically a small town. And the refinery manager is basically responsible of getting all the employees home safely and out of harm's way. And one of the risks that the refinery manager wants to avoid is having their picture on the front page of a news media site or a newspaper the next morning for their parents and siblings and friends all to read that 2 people perished in the hurricane impact at a refinery. So this is a significant personal and career risk, definitely an emotional, rhetorical dynamic that we can communicate, that there's certainly some pressure, some tension on the refinery manager. Moving on, we establish a second peak. So we have risks in California. So the refineries there have particular risks. Hurricanes and tsunamis impact Valero refineries, and then severe storms impact Valero refineries. So we have 2 peaks in this particular story, which is perfectly fine. There's no limit on them. The only limits is in how we define these different types of views. And now we've created quite a bit of tension. We have a lot of tension in Texas, a lot of tension in California, the 2 locations where Valero has refineries, lots of different weather risks. And now we need to resolve this tension. So we provide a release. So as a position, how do we resolve this tension? We've defined this view as the rollout of GPS tracking devices to all refinery locations. Now, what's going on here is that there's a dynamic of storm tracking that NOAA and the National Weather Service does a really good job of tracking the speed, intensity, and direction that a hurricane is traveling. And they can also make fairly accurate predictions of where the path is going to lead as the hurricane comes on land, and where the particular point of impacts might be, as well as providing some advice and advisory on where there'll be hurricane and wind and rain impacts, as well as a larger area of flooding impacts from the hurricane. So this becomes relevant to refinery managers because there's a conversation that's going to be occurring between these national weather services and the refinery. And the important point is that, yes, every refinery manager knows where they are in their refinery. But the critical thing to put together is the specific geolocation of the storm, of the hurricane, and the specific geolocation of the refinery. Because if the refinery manager is providing the weather service an exact geolocation of where they are, the weather service or NOAA can provide them a very, very accurate time estimate on when they can expect the hurricane to hit. And so, okay, on Tuesday at 2:35 p.m., the hurricane will begin to touch your particular refinery, and maximum impact will be 20 minutes later in the afternoon. Now, in order to provide that full communication, we need to have GPS in our refinery locations. And what we visualized here is refinery locations that do and do not have GPS. And the way that it resolves the tension is while we cannot not change or stop the weather, we can forecast and respond to it much more accurately. And this provides a particular solution of putting GPS tracking devices in each one of the refinery locations as a solution to help manage weather impacts, which improves this communication with government agencies. So hopefully that gives you full and more nuanced and interesting story structure to work from. Any of the three story structures will work just fine, and you are selecting from one of those three. So there's been a fairly extensive amount of current research done, particularly by Neil Cohn that developed the third model. And these are the three sort of established models of creating a story arc and a data narrative. So let's talk a little bit about analytical stories. So analytical stories are a sequence of worksheets or dashboards that follow a storyline. So we're going to create a sequence of data visualizations as events. Analytical stories help us to demonstrate how facts are connected in frames of evidence. So we can represent sort of a cause in one particular data visualization. Perhaps it was a particular decision. And then in a later visualization or a data visualization that follows it in sequence, what the effect of that decision was, positive, negative, or otherwise. Analytical stories explain how decisions relate to outcomes. So just like I explained, there's a before visualization and an outcome visualization, or a decision and outcome. We can create fully interactive worksheets. So one of the wonderful things about analytical stories, and the one we're looking at here has been created in Tableau. The same capability exists in Lumira, as well as some other software packages. In these specific data visualization packages, they offer a capability that is not necessarily present natively in PowerPoint. So some folks may have said, well, why don't we just create, PowerPoint? Well, here's the thing that analytical stories do a little bit better. They provide for these fully interactive worksheets or dashboards. So you may have a story structured, different events we're proceeding through in the stepper. So what we're looking at here, we have a title. Underneath the title, we have what are known as different story points. So these story points are little pieces of commentary that tell us what's interesting at each step in the story as we step through the different visualizations. And then underneath, or related to each one of those story points that progresses across the top, is a data visualization. And so we're basically sequencing a series of data visualization views into a story. Now, back to the fully interactive worksheet or dashboards. So imagine we're at a particular place in the story. We've created a particular data visualization. Maybe it's a trend line like this one or a map. And we've encoded it with the data set that the executive team said they wanted to see. But in the presentation, for example, the chief financial officer says, that's nice, but I really wanted to see this for the Asia region. So here's where Tableau and Lumira and some of these data visualization suites that create stories really excel. At that time, instead of saying, okay, we'll take some notes, we'll go back and we'll reconstruct a PowerPoint deck and we'll present that to you, because when we go that path, then we're back to in a reschedule mode. We're trying to reschedule executives, and it ends up taking quite a bit of time. What we're able to do instead here is basically within a particular story frame, we can actually engage the data visualization in an interactive way. We can change the filter, or in the case of Lumira, the input control, and we could refilter the data or reset the data for just the Asia region, and in real time provide to the CFO an answer to their question, which provides quite a bit of power and efficiency for communication with different management personnel. And so now let's walk through creating a story, basically the mechanics of creating a story using a software suite like Tableau. So one of the first things we'll come to is we're going to select a story. So different points in the semester we've performed an analytical sheet and an analysis, basically a single frame data visualization. We could also create a dashboard that integrates multiple visualizations. We're going to create a story here that sequences multiple data visualizations as events. So down at the bottom, we might scroll over to the right, past all the existing tabs, and select the little storybook icon. And when we do, this is the view that we'll see. Over on the left-hand side, all of the analysis sheets and dashboards that we've created will be listed for us there. So everything in the workbook that can be integrated into a story will be listed there. From there, we can basically select any of the data visualizations or dashboards and drag it to our first story point there. So up at the top, we have a number of different locations for our story points. You see the different gray story points and the rectangles at the top there that are representing different events or parts of a story. And so this is going to be things like our beginning, our middle, our end, our peaks, resolution, etc. So then we may want to format the overall story. So also right underneath our sheets there, we have some formatting, story size, how do we want navigation to work, etc. In the story menu, defined as B in this visual frame, that provides us with copying and exporting the story as an image. So if we wanted to copy this particular story or export it as a PDF, we could use the story menu there. So the navigator, designed as C, so if you look at the C area there where we have our gray rectangles, those are where we create story points. And our story points are not titles. And this is a very important distinction. So our title up at the top frames the whole story or the whole view. What we're doing with each story point is we're talking about the insight. What's cool? What do we want our audience to focus in on in this data visualization? That's what should go in the particular story point that is the gray rectangle. Story points can be added and duplicated. So if we go over to D, we can create a new story point. We can select on that. It'll create us a new untitled story point that we can then title and engage. So these are some of the mechanics of how do I create a story in Tableau. Now let's walk through an example provided by Tableau. So first, we're presenting data as a story. So the first thing we're going to do here with our first story point is set the stage. Okay, so we see our title is Earthquakes. Are they on the rise? So this is going to be a story about earthquakes, and we're curious, are we having more or less of them? We want to answer, where in the world are we and what time is it? And as we can see here, there's been a pretty good representation of where are we in the world. We see the global map here. And then it's also been tagged at least to a fairly early date of 1973. And this represents a whole bunch of earthquakes around the world, color encoded with different magnitude. It also has an overlay here of the different plates that may be involved, predominantly because the different fault lines where the plates are moving against each other tend to be prime locations for earthquakes. Okay, so we've set the stage. Now we're going to have some rising action. So we look at a follow-on story point here. Recent megaquakes have created significant damage and loss of life. And we can see here in the annotation, the note at the top of the data visualization, that they've given us a visualization of selected earthquakes above magnitude of 8. So these are very large earthquakes that it's represented on the screen here and their geolocation. So this is going to start creating some anticipation. Yes, we're having some very large earthquakes around the world. Then we define a peak in the action. So on this one, the 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake is the third largest in history. We have a little annotation, magnitude 9.1. So off the west coast of northern Sumatra. So quite a few people lost their lives from this particular earthquake. So it's certainly a point of maximum tension. We move on to an additional peak in action. So the 2011 Japan earthquake is the fifth largest in history. So again, a 9.0 magnitude. Notice that in the story point up at the top, we're defining sort of what's unique or interesting, or what do we want our audience to be thinking about here. And now that we've created quite a bit of tension with two peaks, we need to resolve that tension. So we started off this story with a question: are earthquakes on the rise? And the way that we can resolve tension in our story is by answering that question, providing some answers. So here we've established the trend line of earthquakes over time, and that's going to resolve our question. So we can see, if we look down at the bottom, we have the trend lines of both Europe, Middle East, and Africa, North and South America. And we see, in fact, there is an upward trend of earthquakes in these two regions. Then we look up a little further, we see the Asia-Pacific region. We see pretty significant slope upward earthquakes. And so we would most certainly have some concern about the rising number of earthquakes in the Asia-Pacific region. And to finally break it down to, what does this really mean in the real world? Well, if we lived in a country in Asia-Pacific, we might be very vocal about one of the top 10 issues that the government should be managing is earthquake response, particularly giving all of the significant increase in trend in earthquakes in Asia Pacific. And then EMEA in North and South America, yes, it might be a top 20 issue, but it may not be in the top 5 or top 10 based on where the earthquakes are occurring. So in wrapping up the creation of our data narrative here, first we want to select a media appropriate for the audience. So we've got lots of different choices. We want to figure out, is my audience just going to spend a brief period of time, maybe just a couple minutes? If so, I might give them an infographic video. If it's a broader audience, we might want to give them a single frame data visualization, perhaps on a subject that everyone's interested in, like income. And as well, we might have a very specific data visualization for a certain group of people, like institutional traders, stock traders, or we might want to have an exploratory data application like Selfie City. We will create visualizations as evidence. So remember that in every story, what we're doing is presenting evidence for a particular position. So we want to create a good cross-section of visualizations. It's very common to create multiple data visualizations of the same data set and then perform an editing or curating role where we're going to choose the very best one out of the group and utilize that as evidence. You should choose a rhetorical argument. So you'll move from boring statistics to entertaining story through your utilization of rhetorical arguments. And those arguments can be used in how you structure the data visualization. You can use alternative frames, story points, particular titles, annotations. So there's lots of different ways that you can apply the rhetoric. I simply encourage you to do so. And then structure your story in a meaningful way. So we have 3 different story structures. We have Aristotle's 3-act play, Freytag's pyramid of 5 different steps, as well as Neil Cohn's visual frame-based narrative structure. And similarly to the rhetorical argument, it's not of particular urgency which one of the 3 story structures you select. Just make sure you select one. This concludes our lecture on narrative visualization.